Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Look, if you're a focused learner who just wants to cut right through the noise and get straight to the facts, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're unpacking the incredibly complex, rapidly shifting geopolitical fallout from the recent collapse of the US-Iran nuclear talks. And we're going to impartially map out exactly what the source material is telling us about this massive diplomatic breakdown, relying strictly on the data and the statements provided. We'll explore how this single event is sending literal shockwaves across the globe, altering alliances from Europe to the Gulf, and potentially reshaping the entire future of global security and energy markets. It's a lot, so let's get into it. Okay, let's dive right into this. To make sense of this geopolitical chessboard, we're going to look at this event from 5 distinct angles. 1. The nuclear talks collapse itself. 2. Iran and the IRGC's strategy. 3. Europe's pushback and criticism. 4. Israel's sidelined role. And finally, 5. Shifting Gulf state alliances. To immediately understand the stakes here, just take a look at this highly provocative quote from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. He said, "The U.S. leadership is being thoroughly humiliated." Wow, that perfectly sets the stage for us, doesn't it? It shows that this isn't just some isolated bilateral issue between the U.S. and Iran. It's a global spectacle drawing open, very direct criticism from traditional allies. All right, moving into Section 1, the nuclear talks collapse. Now, the source points to what looks like a massive strategic miscalculation by U.S. leadership. The initial calculation, well, there was this highly confident belief that overwhelming force would lead to a swift resolution. We're talking wrapping things up in just 2 to 3 days. But the current reality on the ground is a stark contrast. Facing intense domestic political pressure plus heavy international scrutiny, the U.S. actually found itself essentially begging for peace. That initial expectation of a quick, clean victory, it completely unraveled. Let's move to how this builds and look at the specific sequence of these diplomatic failures. First off, U.S. envoys were sent to Pakistan for initial back-channeling. Step 2, they locked into grueling 22-hour negotiating sessions that, frankly, yielded absolutely nothing. Step 3, the delegation is forced to return completely empty-handed. And finally, in a move that basically signaled the total collapse of the effort, the U.S. deliberately withheld key figures like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff from a second round of talks. That move effectively ensured the whole process just stalled out completely. Which brings us to Section 2, Iran and the IRGC's strategy. You simply cannot understand Iran's negotiating posture without looking at the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The source material makes it incredibly clear that they are the absolute backbone of Iran's strategy here. See, the diplomatic negotiators at the table knew without a shadow of a doubt that if they yielded even slightly on their nuclear program, the IRGC would immediately intervene and shut the whole thing down. They enforced a completely rigid, uncompromising stance. So what did those leverage tactics actually look like in practice? Well, despite suffering from a heavily crippled economy under severe sanctions, Iran utterly refused to act from a place of weakness. They absolutely refused to yield their nuclear program, basically insisting that any peace must happen strictly on their own terms. And to back up this hardline stance, they looked outward. The source highlights that the Iranian foreign minister actually traveled to Russia to seek Vladimir Putin's support. It was a very clear message to the U.S. Iran has powerful friends of its own. But there is a much deeper historical layer here, too. The source suggests the IRGC has been playing a seriously long game. They've essentially been biding their time, waiting for a moment of distinct U.S. political vulnerability. Why? Because they want to avenge senior commanders who were previously eliminated by highly targeted U.S. and Israeli intelligence operations. So for the IRGC, holding the line in these negotiations isn't just about protecting a nuclear program, it's about historical payback. Okay, let's shift the perspective over to Section 3, Europe's pushback and criticism. And this brilliantly illustrates just how broad the fallout really is. It's not just one dissenting voice in the room. The source specifically lists key allied leaders: Friedrich Merz of Germany, Keir Starmer of the UK, Emmanuel Macron of France, and even Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, who are all reportedly voicing deep frustration. Some are even described as quietly enjoying the situation, remembering times when they felt somewhat bullied by U.S. policies. It represents a massive consensus across Europe, pushing back against the U.S.'s current diplomatic approach. The absolute core of Europe's frustration is captured perfectly in this critique from the source. What is the exit strategy? Regime change or fulfilled objectives? right? European leaders are reportedly baffled by what they see as entirely chaotic, contradictory policies. They feel the US administration lacks a coherent strategy, constantly moving the goalposts between wanting total regime change in Iran on one hand and simply wanting to fulfill immediate security objectives on the other. This lack of clarity, it's actively alienating traditional allies. We can actually map out the timeline of this fractured relationship. The source points to a pivotal moment on February 28th, when a US and Israeli attack was launched without consulting European allies at all. Then, when the mid-conflict expectation of a quick victory completely shattered, the US suddenly found itself needing help. But jump to the current day, when the US requested those same European allies to send minesweepers to clear the Strait of Hormuz, the Europeans refused. Their logic is pretty straightforward. You didn't consult us when you started this, so don't ask us to clean it up now. Let's pivot to another crucial regional player in Section 4, Israel's sidelined role. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast in political priorities between these two super close allies. The source outlines that the primary U.S. objective right now is heavily influenced by domestic politics. Specifically, they want to secure a rapid peace deal before the upcoming November elections. But in total contrast, the Israeli objective is framed as maintaining the conflict to ensure the long-term degradation of threats to their security. Honestly, these two timelines are completely incompatible. And because of those incompatible objectives, the source reports a startling dynamic. The U.S. intentionally sidelined Israel from the peace talks. Desperate for a pre-election diplomatic win, U.S. leadership feared that any Israeli involvement would instantly sabotage those fragile 22-hour talks we discussed earlier. So, to keep that incredibly narrow window for peace open, the U.S. made the calculated decision to keep its closest regional ally out of the room entirely. Finally, let's zoom out for Section 5, Shifting Gulf State Alliances. The data here points to a massive fundamental shift. Historically, U.S. military bases in the Gulf were viewed as this great protective shield, high strategic value for deterrence, right? But the source indicates the current view has entirely flipped. These bases are now seen as an imminent liability. Instead of deterring attacks, host nations actually fear the presence of U.S. bases creates a direct threat of drawing Iranian fire right onto their own soil. And look, this isn't just some theoretical fear. The source explicitly lists specific nations, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, that are actively reconsidering the U.S. military presence within their borders. These are incredibly wealthy, increasingly well-armed nations, and they're quietly concluding that they actually possess the capability to defend themselves now, and more importantly, that relying on U.S. bases might actually be doing them more harm than good. So the crucial point is this: the whole dynamic has inverted. The growing regional fear is the threat of becoming collateral damage. If the U.S. and Iran escalate tensions, these Gulf states worry that simply hosting American troops makes them automatic targets for Iranian retaliatory strikes. Because of the chaotic policies we discussed earlier, they just don't trust the U.S. to shield them anymore. They fear the U.S. will drag them into a war they absolutely do not want. For anyone watching global energy markets or international security, this is a profound geopolitical pivot. Which leaves us with this profound final question based on everything the source has laid out. Have these diplomatic miscalculations permanently fractured the unified Western Front in West Asia? Think about it. Between European pushback, a sidelined Israel, and Gulf states quietly wanting U.S. bases closed, the geopolitical map looks vastly different today than it did just a few months ago. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer. Keep reflecting on that question, keep learning, and I'll see you next time as we unpack another critical topic together.